Hello there, I'm Los the Artist, and welcome to another episode. When your job is to drive people around, you meet people from all walks of life. John had met many people and seen many things during his time driving. When a particular fare seemed to put themselves into a potentially dangerous situation, John felt inclined to help. But John would quickly learn that some things are better left alone. Tonight's tale is called Rideshare. John made his living driving for rideshare apps. The hours were long and the money wasn't the best, but he was getting by. His days usually consisted of sitting in his car waiting for one of his apps to notify him of a fare. Then he'd go pick them up and take them where they were going, and then repeat the whole process. Driving around wasn't always the most exciting job, but occasionally a customer would surprise him with a good conversation or an interesting ride. Tough times had forced him into doing this kind of work, but he had become complacent and was too lazy to look for a different job. He juggled driving for both the major rideshare apps as well as two regional popular ones, and one specifically for medical transportation that was paid for by the state. He had two smartphones and a tablet that allowed him to do all this at the same time, and he had gotten pretty good at it. John had also learned to identify specific things when accepting fares on the apps. People often requested return trips or listed multiple stops, which always meant for a good fare. One thing that John wasn't particularly keen on seeing were fares that did not list a destination address. These fares were always gambles that could be short and a hassle and not worth the time, or long rides across town or even out of town. He'd gotten one that went out of state once. John could never have guessed that day would be so different when he accepted a no destination listed fare. John was sitting in his car in the parking lot of a gas station he had just filled up at. He logged off all his apps so he could go inside for a bathroom break and a cup of coffee. When he got back into his car and logged back into his first app, he immediately got a fare notification. It had a pickup address, but no destination. John didn't want his driver rating to go down for non-acceptance that day, so he took the fare. It was set for immediate pickup, so he headed over right away. When he arrived at the pickup address, John was displeased to find that it was a group home for young men. This explained the "please call upon arrival" note in the driver instructions section of John's rideshare app. Given the type of residents these places housed, John wasn't very hopeful that this would be a very big fare, but he figured money is money, and if he could get through this one quickly, he might be able to pick up something better soon. He clicked the arrive button on his app and then clicked call passenger. A young man's voice answered, and John asked for Clinton. The voice replied, "Are you here?" John confirmed that he was, and the young man told him he'd be right out. John ended the call and waited. A few minutes later, a young man in his early 20s exited the front door of the group home and approached John's car. He had shaggy blonde hair and was dressed in scraggly clothing. He was carrying a very large gym bag that was completely stuffed with something. He also carried a pillow and a blanket. Clinton opened the rear passenger door of John's car and got in. He sat with all that he was carrying on his lap. He closed the door and greeted John. Then he sat forward and unfolded a map. He explained to John that he did not include a destination address on the app because he wasn't sure what to put in. When John asked him where he was going, he held out the map and pointed at it. He told John, "Somewhere right around here." John looked at the map and recognized the area of the map Clinton was pointing to. John explained to him that the destination was about an hour and a half's drive, actually 2 counties over, and the fare would be substantial. Clinton replied that it was fine, and he held a handful of cash up to show John. He explained that it was John's tip as he preferred to tip cash, and told him that he was not concerned about the fare. Then he motioned for John to take the cash. John asked Clinton if he was an auditor from the rideshare company, as taking cash tips was against policy. Clinton assured him that all was fine and to look for his profile on the app to see that he was a 5-star passenger, he used the app for transportation all the time. He told John that he realized the ride would be long, and given the cost of fuel and vehicular repairs, he felt it only fair to compensate John accordingly. He further explained that more people should tip in cash despite the rules, as it was best for the drivers to not have to claim it on taxes. He again urged John to take the cash and told him he would add a minuscule tip onto the app at the conclusion of the ride to make things seem more legitimate. John reluctantly took the money from Clinton and unfolded it to count it. It was $200. He again asked Clinton if he was sure, as the fare would almost be equal to what he had given him in cash. Clinton smiled and once again assured John that all was well. John agreed and decided he needed to step up his customer service a bit, given his passengers' generosity. He asked Clinton if there was a certain genre of music he would prefer to listen to on the ride on the radio. Clinton told him that he would actually prefer no music at all. He wanted silence for the entirety of the ride. He told John that this actually included conversation. He said that once they were en route, he wanted no further interaction until arrival. The thought made John a little uncomfortable, but he had driven customers that didn't talk before, just not this far. After reconsidering how much money he was going to make on this one fare, John asked Clinton if he was okay with him setting his GPS. He knew where he was going, but he didn't want Clinton thinking that he was attempting to pad the ride. He explained that it was to keep Clinton updated on their travel progress. Clinton said that if it was fine, and after setting the GPS to the town they were headed to, John began to drive. As the ride went on and the two exited the metropolitan area and entered the desert countryside for the next county, the awkward silence was already beginning to get to John. He occasionally glanced in his rearview mirror at Clinton. Clinton just sat with his head leaning against the window, staring out. He sat that way the entire time, never moving. Just when John would begin to worry that something was wrong with him, Clinton would sigh or scratch his nose, and John would be assured that his passenger was okay. John couldn't help but wonder what the kid was thinking about in the silence. He filled his own head with images of him defending himself against Clinton at some point along this ride. Could he trust his passenger? Would Clinton try something to get the cash back? John felt uneasy and felt that he needed to prepare himself for some worst-case scenarios. John was breaking a rule by taking the cash tip, but there was another rule that he broke every day, just in case. John carried a 9mm handgun in his car. About halfway through the trip, John's GPS directed them off one highway and onto another. The information seemed to disturb Clinton at first. He quickly sat forward and began looking out all the windows. John asked him if he was okay, but Clinton snapped at him to be quiet. After a few moments, Clinton seemingly regained his sense of direction and calmed down. He sat back and leaned his head back against the window. After the transition to the next highway, the desert countryside changed to high desert mountains. The temperature outside was cooler in this area due to the elevation. Clinton asked if he could roll down the window, and John approved. Clinton put the window down and breathed in deeply. He seemed to be taking in the mountain air like it was hydration for the soul. The anxiety in the car changed to a sense of tranquility. For the first time on the ride, John felt like everything was going to be fine. The trip took longer than John had anticipated, and after an hour and a half, Clinton asked if they were close to the destination. John explained that they were close to reaching the town limits of the general area where he had pointed on the map, but that he wasn't sure how far out they were from where their ultimate destination was. As he pulled into the town, Clinton once again sat forward. He was looking out all the windows again. This time it didn't appear to be out of suspicion, though. He seemed to be searching for a sense of familiarity. John couldn't tell if Clinton was reading the street signs or just trying to get a feel for things. They approached an exit on the highway, and Clinton shouted for John to take it. He exited and knew where they were headed now. John had spent a lot of time in this little mountain mining town during his childhood. He had family that had lived there years ago, but all had since moved on, so it had been a number of years since he had been there. The exit he had been instructed to take would quickly lead them out of town again. The next town was an even smaller one and several miles away, near a lake. John asked Clinton if he was sure they were going in the right direction and explained his familiarity with the area. He told Clinton about the proximity of the next town, and there was pretty much nothing but mountainside between them. Clinton told him that he would let him know where to stop. John grew a little uneasy again. The two got several miles out of town, and just before reaching the halfway point of the next town, Clinton sat forward and began looking around again. He then declared, "John, right here is fine." John hesitated to stop, and Clinton shouted at him again, "I said right here is fine." John pulled over on the extremely narrow shoulder, and there was a metal barricade to keep vehicles from going over the edge of the road and down the mountainside. Clinton asked John if he was sure the cash tip was enough. John looked at the miles he had logged on the app. The ride would total nearly $250. John assured Clinton the tip was fine, and asked him again if he was sure that this is where he wanted to stop. Clinton told him the spot was fine and got out of the car. He carried his gym bag, pillow, and blanket in a large wad in his arms like a child. John attempted to thank him and asked him if he would eventually need a return trip, but Clinton was out of the car and on his way too quickly. The car door closed behind Clinton, and John watched over his shoulder as Clinton walked a little way back the way they had come. When he reached the point where he had originally asked John to stop, he hopped over the metal barricade and began to scale down the mountainside. John sat in his car confused for a few moments. He couldn't help but wonder where Clinton was going. He stared out the rear window at the spot where Clinton had hopped over the barricade for a short time. Then he shook his head as if to clear it and decided to head back home. He checked for traffic, but only out of a safe driving habit because there was no one else on the stretch of road and he hadn't seen another vehicle in miles. He made a U-turn and slowly approached the area where Clinton had hopped the barricade. He made a note of the mile marker, 333, and then started to drive back toward the little mining town. As he drove back to town, John continued to wonder what Clinton was doing now in the middle of nowhere. Was he on some kind of journey of self-discovery? Was it some kind of strange getting in touch with nature? Then John's thoughts got a little darker. Was Clinton doing some kind of into the wild type spiritual thing without actually knowing what he was doing? Was he in danger out there in the high desert? There were mountain lions, coyotes, and several other dangerous animals out there. Not to mention that the nights in the high desert were surprisingly bitter cold. As John drove back into the little mining town, he decided to top off his fuel tank for the ride home. He pulled into the first gas station he came to and parked. The notification chime on the rideshare app that Clinton had used to book the trip went off. John looked down at his phone. Clinton had added an additional 30% tip to the fare. John was shocked and although grateful for the generosity and luck he had booking this fare, he now wondered if leaving Clinton out there alone was the right thing to do. John got out of his car and began fueling it. His thoughts remained on Clinton. The kid seemed so naive, fragile, sure, and confused at the same time. John continued to wonder why Clinton was out there. He finished fueling his car and got back into the driver's seat. He looked at the time. It was late afternoon. He wanted to check on Clinton, but he could no longer contact him on the app as they had concluded the trip and it was the only method of contact he had for him. John tried to convince himself that Clinton did have a phone with him and he could call for help if needed, but it didn't make him feel any better. John felt bad that he had let Clinton wander off into danger like that, especially since he had been so generous. John decided that he needed to make sure Clinton was okay. Unfortunately, the only way to do that was to head back to mile marker 333 and look for him. John made sure he was logged out of all his rideshare apps and started his car. He pulled out of the gas station and headed back toward where he had dropped Clinton off. A short time later, John arrived back at mile marker 333. He sat in his car for a few moments, wondering why he was there. He didn't understand why he was so concerned with Clinton's well-being. John sometimes hated himself for being so empathetic towards people he didn't know. He knew that he wouldn't want to be out there in the high desert alone, especially at night. So he felt that Clinton was either going to get hurt or hurt himself. John now started to hope that he wasn't too late and turned off his car's engine. He walked around the car and over to the mile marker. He looked down at it. It seemed ominous for some reason. John looked up and stepped over the road barricade. He walked over to the edge of the mountainside. This particular part of the mountainside wasn't so steep. He could see how Clinton could have easily climbed down. He tried to see down into the ravine below, but it was a fair distance down and he really couldn't see anything clearly. John cursed himself for carrying so much and started to make his way down the mountainside. As he got a little down the hill, John could see what looked like people moving around in an area at the bottom of the ravine. Had Clinton met up with others? John thought that it also may not be Clinton at all. He wasn't sure about boundaries or anything, but he knew that people often came up into this area to hunt. If this was a hunting camp, the placement did seem a little odd, but now John's curiosity grew as big as his concern for Clinton. As John continued down the mountainside, he came to a ridge. As he stood on the ridge, he now had a clear view of the camp he had spotted. He took his phone out and tried to use it to zoom in on the camp to get a better view. He could see 4 people. They each had pillows and blankets that they had ranged around what appeared to be the early stages of a campfire. They were all wearing what looked like adult-size onesie pajamas. John felt confused, but he could see that Clinton was one of them. Although all seemed well, as he could clearly see that Clinton was part of whatever this group was, John still felt the need to check on the group to make sure they knew what they were getting into camping here. He continued to make his way down, and now headed toward the camp. A short time later, John could hear the group at the camp talking and laughing. As he approached the camp, one of them noticed him and stood up. The rest of the group turned to see what the young woman was looking at, and also stood up when they saw John approaching. John waved at the group to show he was friendly, and hoped that Clinton recognized him. He could see and hear the group chattering to each other about him, but he could not make out what they were saying. He continued to approach, though now a little reluctant. Clinton held his hands up to the rest of his group in a "give me a moment" gesture and began walking toward John. The two met a short distance from the camp, and Clinton asked John what he was doing there. John explained that he was concerned about him wandering down into the desert. They didn't converse much on the way, so he did not know that Clinton was meeting up with friends. John apologized for intruding, but attempted to assure Clinton that he just wanted to make sure he was okay. Clinton told John that he was fine and that he should probably leave. As Clinton urged John to leave, one of Clinton's companions shouted at them. It was a young man, not much older than Clinton. He shouted for Clinton to bring his friend to the campsite. Clinton turned and looked at the other young man. Then he looked back at John. The other young man shouted at Clinton again and assured that everything was fine. Clinton told John to come with him, and the two walked over to the campsite. As he approached the others, John took a closer look at what Clinton was wearing. He realized that it wasn't a onesie, it was a costume. It was shaggy and had a long shaggy tail. It had gloves and foot slippers attached to it. When they got to the campsite, John could see that Clinton's companions were wearing similar costumes. Each appeared to be a different type of animal. John looked around at Clinton's companions. Beside the young man that called them over to the camp, there was another young man and a young woman about the same age as Clinton. The young woman was wearing a tan costume with a little tail. One of the young men resembled her, and he wore a similar tan costume, but he had a long, thin tail. The young man who had called them over appeared to be wearing a bird costume, as it had feathers. As they reached the camp, the young man in the bird suit welcomed John and asked his name. He replied that his name was John, and the young man introduced himself as Ferris. He then introduced the other two as Leonardo and Roberta, or Leo and Bobby as they preferred. He then made a comment on how he presumed that John already knew Clinton. Ferris apologized to John for the group's unusual appearance and explained that they had a ritual the group partook in from time to time, and John stumbled upon their latest location for it. John looked around again at the group and couldn't resist himself. He asked them if they were furries. Ferris laughed and replied that was what some people called them, but he had never really been sure what that meant. He explained to John that he was probably referring to the type of people that were known for their odd sexual tendencies, and that was not what this group was. He told John that for starters, Leo and Bobby were brother and sister, and she was the only female. They didn't really have a good mix for any kind of bizarre costumed orgy. Ferris also pointed out that none of them were currently wearing their masks, which he believed defeated the purpose of the furry lifestyle to begin with. John acknowledged the points that Ferris had made, and then he asked the group to forgive his curiosity, and he asked them what the ritual that Ferris had alluded to was. He wanted to know why they were there. Ferris told John that Clinton, Leo, and Bobby were all attempting to join a membership into an exclusive hunting club. He said that he was there to guide them through their initiation. John was confused. What kind of hunting club dresses in plushy animal costumes? John looked at Clinton. Clinton seemed agitated, almost nervous. Ferris invited John to stay and observe the hunt, and that seemed to make Clinton even more uncomfortable. John told Ferris that he had a decent drive and he should get back home, and he attempted to graciously decline Ferris's offer. Ferris insisted and offered to pay John additional money to stay since he was technically in the middle of a workday. John told Ferris that it wasn't necessary, that Clinton had been more than generous, and that he should just be leaving. Ferris's mood seemed to change a little at John's refusal. He told John that if he insisted on leaving, he should do so immediately. The overall mood of the entire group changed. Bobby told Ferris that they couldn't go against the rules of the hunt. John didn't know what that meant, but he didn't like the way it sounded. Ferris turned and walked toward Bobby and Leo, and the three engaged in a whispered conversation. Clinton rushed over to John and told him to run. John looked at Clinton, confused, and Clinton told him that one of the rules of the hunt was no witnesses, and another was the weak must be given a head start. Then he told John again, "Run." John hesitated, and Clinton shot him a look of urgency. The other three were still whispering to each other, so John took the opportunity and followed Clinton's advice. He was a few hundred yards from the camp when Leo finally noticed him running and alerted Ferris. As John ran and began to make his ascent back up the road, he could hear Ferris and the others shouting at Clinton. John soon discovered that the climb back up the mountainside was much more difficult than descending it was. Going down, he hadn't realized exactly how far he had walked. Looking back up at the road, he was at least a half a mile from the car and had already run a good distance up an easy part of the hillside. He was now coming to a much steeper climb. He reached the ridge where he had first spotted the camp and climbed up. He turned to once again look at the camp. John could see all four standing in a row. They were each holding the head of their costume under an arm. He turned and looked up at the road and finished catching his breath. He looked back at the camp again to see that they were still standing there, watching. John felt disturbed, but he felt he had gotten enough distance and that he was safe. He decided to finish his climb back up to his car, but as he turned to take his first step, he heard Ferris shouting his name. John turned, and Ferris shouted again. He said, "Time's up, John." John watched as Leo and Bobby put on the heads of their costumes. Clinton appeared to hesitate, and John could hear Ferris shouting something at him. As he attempted to understand what Ferris was saying to Clinton, he failed to notice what was happening to Leo and Bobby. The two were down on all fours, writhing around, not apparently in pain, but in ecstasy. John finally noticed Leo and Bobby as something even stranger began to happen. As he stood on the ridge, John was too far from the camp to see clearly what was going on. But the costumes the two wore were no longer soft, plush, and baggy. They had seemingly fused with their costume and transformed into twisted, horrifying versions of what the plushy costumes once were. Leo was now some kind of twisted blend of man and mountain lion. Bobby took the appearance of an inhuman bobcat. John could see that something unusual was happening as the movements of the siblings became more animal-like. For a moment, He was mesmerized by the horrific scene, but then he remembered Clinton's warning about the rules and Ferris declaring that time was up. As John attempted to comprehend what he was witnessing, he saw that Ferris and Clinton were finished arguing and were once again watching him. Clinton raised his costume's head and put it on. As he did so, the two beasts that were once Leo and Bobby began running toward John's position. Ferris stood in place, holding his costume head under his arm. When John realized the two beasts were headed for him, he turned and began to run up the hillside as quickly as he could. As John struggled to get up the hill, he tried not to look behind him, fearing that whatever was coming after him would be right there. He clawed and scraped at the mountainside in an attempt to get up faster as his lungs began to burn from the uphill running. He could hear growls and steps of a beast in the near distance. As he reached the ledge of the roadside, John realized that he was about 100 yards from his car. He hadn't come up at the exact point he had started down and had to run again. The fear those beasts were coming up the hillside was enough motivation to start running again before catching his breath. John climbed over the safety barricade and began running down the road toward his car. As he ran, he heard something else jump over the barricade as if it jumped off, followed by a roar of something that sounded like a mountain lion, but larger. As John ran for his car, he could hear heavy footsteps quickly approaching behind him. John was close to his car, and just as he thought he was going to make it, he felt a massive blow to his side that sent him over the barricade and tumbling down the hillside. John realized that he'd been tackled by one of the beasts. The two were entangled as they tumbled down a steep part of the hillside. John could feel scratches as he struggled to keep the beast's jaws from clamping down on his face. After tumbling a good distance back down the hillside, the two came to a flat ledge with a large rock in the middle. Luck was on John's side this time, and the two came to an abrupt halt when the beast's back struck the rock with great force. The beast cried out in pain and struggled with its back against the rock for a moment. John crawled back away from the beast and managed to get to his feet. The beast was also able to stand, and although it appeared injured, it turned its attention back to John and let out a terrifying roar. John turned to run as the beast lunged at him. Just as John thought the beast was going to take him down again, he heard the growl of another beast as it launched itself at the first one. John stopped for a moment and turned to see the two beasts now engaged in battle. John thought the first beast had to be Leo, as it resembled a twisted human-like mountain lion. The second beast looked just as horrid, but it appeared to be a coyote-human hybrid. It was Clinton. John watched in shock as the beasts ripped and tore at each other. Although the lion beast was larger, the coyote began to get the upper hand. The injury the lion had suffered when its spine struck the rock had weakened it severely, and as it attempted a desperate lunge at the coyote beast ducked and was able to grab the lion's throat in its jaws. The two beasts tumbled to a stop, with the coyote on top. As the lion kicked and snarled, the coyote beast ripped at its throat, but surprisingly, no blood came forth initially. The coyote beast slowly ripped off the head of the lion beast, but instead of the beast dying, they began to writhe around as if to change. In a short moment, the terrible lion beast was gone, and the coyote beast stood atop Leo in his lion costume. Leo shouted and begged the coyote beast not to do it. What was happening, John thought, as the coyote beast then grabbed Leo by his human throat, and with a quick snap of its jaws and twist of its head, ripped Leo's throat out. This time, blood shot out of Leo's throat as he kicked and convulsed while he choked on his own blood. As Leo stopped moving, John stood eye to eye with the coyote beast. The coyote then stood on its hind legs in a bizarrely human fashion, raised its forelegs as if it were going to remove its own head. As it did, another beast leapt over the ridge and pounced it. The third beast was about the same size as the coyote beast, and appeared to be a very human-like bobcat. The two beasts rolled and tumbled and snarled and growled as they fought. John snapped himself out of the mesmerized state and turned to run back up the hillside to his car. John began to climb back up the hill as fast as he could. He could still hear the two beasts fighting. As he reached the roadway again, he was much closer to his car this time. He climbed over the barricade and started running for the car. John was so tired now that his run was barely a slow jog. As he struggled to reach the car, he heard a hiss and a growl behind him. John turned to see the bobcat beast leaping over the rail barricade and running toward him. John turned and ran as hard as he could, but exhausted and sheer panic were beginning to best him. He could hear the beast as it closed in on him. John was almost to his car when he felt the weight of the beast as it pounced on his back. John screamed in pain as the beast's jaws cinched down on his shoulder and huge teeth sank deep into his flesh. John fell forward to the ground with the beast on his back. He was sure he was about to die. The beast released John's shoulder and stood atop him. It let out a haunting yowl as John closed its eyes and prepared for the fatal strike. John heard a yelp from the beast and felt its weight leave his back. He opened his eyes to see the coyote beast had once again pounced the bobcat. As the two beasts battled for the second time, John struggled to crawl toward his car, but his wounded shoulder made it difficult. John heard a haunting scream from the bobcat beast as he looked to see the coyote was standing on the back of the bobcat. Its jaws were clenched on the back of the bobcat's neck. As the hellcat struggled to get free, the coyote clamped down with all the force of its jaws, and the crack of bone echoed off the canyon walls. The bobcat beast stopped moving. The coyote stood over it. Bobcat quickly changed from beast to a bloody plush bobcat costume. The coyote reached down and pulled off the head of the costume to reveal Bobby's mangled corpse inside. John still laid face down on the ground. He was still a short distance from his car and stopped crawling toward it to watch the coyote beast finish off the bobcat. The coyote turned his attention to John, but he was too exhausted to move. He laid still on the ground as the coyote began to run toward him. John again closed his eyes to prepare for death. Seconds later, the coyote reached John and grabbed his belt in its teeth. The beast began to drag John, and he was sure it was taking him to some kind of den to feast. Instead, the beast stopped after only a few strides and propped John up against the side of the car. John opened his eyes to see the coyote beast standing in front of him. The beast leaned back and knelt in a grotesquely human way and reached up with its forelimbs and pulled off its head. The form quickly changed into Clinton in costume. John thought he was hallucinating. Did he hallucinate the whole day? Clinton then began to shout at John to snap out of his daze. He told John to wake up and get into his car. He shouted at John that he needed to leave now. He said Ferris would end the hunt and that he wouldn't be able to stop him like he had Leo and Bobby. John's wits began to return to him. Clinton helped John to his feet and shook him again. He shouted at him again to get into his car and go. John fumbled in his pocket. His key fob was still there. He opened his car door and turned back to Clinton. He asked what he was going to do, and Clinton shouted at John that there was no time and that he just needed to go. Then something snatched up Clinton into the air. John looked up, and despite what he had already seen that day, he couldn't believe his eyes. A huge hawk had Clinton in its grip and was carrying him higher and higher into the sky. Like the other beasts, though, this was obviously not a normal hawk. It had a bizarre, human-like form. John lost sight of the hawk beast, but could hear Clinton screaming. He got into his car and started the engine. John put the transmission in drive and slammed his foot on the accelerator pedal. He performed a U-turn as quickly as he could and began to race back toward the little mining town. As John drove, the panic began to subside, but the disbelief was setting in. How was everything that was happening even possible? How could cute, plush costumes transform people into hideous monsters? Every time John began to doubt, Any of this could be real. His shoulder would throb from the puncture wounds, which still bled. He knew he needed to get to a hospital quickly. John took his phone from his pocket and tried it. Miraculously, it had not been destroyed, but he had no signal because of the mountainside. He tossed his phone into the passenger seat, and just as he turned his attention back to the road, Clinton's body fell from the sky and slammed onto the pavement in front of him. John stomped on the brakes, and the car began to skid. Luckily, John had spent so many hours on the road that even a professional stunt driver would be impressed by his skills. He steered and countersteered and was able to swerve around Clinton to a safe stop. He sat for a moment with his foot on the brake pedal, staring at Clinton's seemingly lifeless body on the roadway. He put the car in park and looked up and around through his windows as best he could, but he couldn't see anything. John remembered that Clinton had told him one of the rules of the hunt was no witnesses. He knew that if he was going to survive, he still had to contend with Ferris, the hawk beast. John remembered that he had his handgun. He cursed himself for being stupid and not taking it with him down into the ravine in the first place. He reached between the seat and center console, and there it was. He pulled it out and removed it from the holster. He took the safety off and cocked it, and then he opened the car door. John cautiously got out of the car and began to scan the sky. He couldn't see Ferris anywhere. He decided to draw Ferris out. John approached Clinton's still motionless body while keeping his handgun at the ready. He reached Clinton and knelt next to him. He shook him, but Clinton did not respond. He turned Clinton over. You could now see that Clinton's chest was torn open. His body was completely broken from the fall. John then heard the cry of a very large hawk. He turned to see the hawk beast swooping down toward him. John had just enough time to fire a shot before the beast was upon him. The shot grazed the beast's side, and it corrected its flight to swoop back up to safety. The beast buzzed just over John's head, and he ducked. Then he turned and fired another shot, which the beast was able to dodge. The beast swooped up over the mountain ridge and out of sight. John made a run for his car to use it as cover now that he had drawn Ferris out. John reached his car, and just as he heard the cry of the hawk beast again, he dove behind it, and the beast swooped down near the ground, narrowly missing John's ankle. John fired another shot at the beast as it swooped back up. He cursed himself for taking such a wild shot, as he knew he wouldn't have time to reload. John scanned the sky, but he couldn't see the beast as it kept using the mountainside for cover. John knew that just a few miles further down the road, the mountain opened up to a brief stretch of flat land. He thought if he could make it there, he may stand a better chance of getting a good shot at the beast. John got back into his car and began to speed toward the area. The hawk beast was large enough that without the cover of the mountain, it would be harder to surprise John with an attack. John thought about the other rule of the hunt that Clinton mentioned, no witnesses. He hoped that Ferris would follow the rule and continue to pursue him, but he also hoped that no other drivers wandered down the roadway in case he was unable to stop the hawk beast. John sped down the road toward the clearing, and as he approached, a large rock hit the roadway right in front of his path. John swerved and just missed the rock as another rock struck the road. John swerved again and looked up through the windshield to see the hawk beast circling above. It was tearing rocks off the hillside and hurling them at John's car. The beast continued to rain down large rocks as John again relied on his driving skills to dodge and weave through the barrage. One of the rocks struck the hood of John's car, and it startled him as he attempted to swerve, and the car began to skid. John quickly corrected, and when he could focus, he realized that he had made it to the clearing. He looked in his rearview mirror and saw the hillside dwindle down to flat land. John pulled to the side of the road and stopped the car. This stretch of road didn't go on for very long. Ahead were more hillsides and then a few bends that led back into the little mining town. The hillsides would again give the hawk beast cover. John also worried that the closer they got to town, the more people might be endangered by this twisted hunt. He knew that he had to confront and take down Ferris right where he was. John got out of the car and took cover beside it. He had his weapon at the ready. He scanned the sky, but didn't see the beast. He stood up to look over the car and scan the rest of the sky. That's when he spotted it. The hawk beast was circling high in the sky a distance away, just before the hillside where their last clash had ended. John wondered if he was planning its next strike. It seemed like it didn't want to stray too far from the hillside. John walked slowly around his car as he kept an eye on the beast. He changed his demeanor from one of caution and fear to confidence. John got around the car and continued walking away from it. He thought that if he offered the beast an easier strike, it might take the opportunity. When he was a fair distance from the car, John stopped and put his hands in the air. John stood there, almost taunting the beast as he watched it circling high in the sky. Then the beast's flight pattern changed. It stopped circling, and John realized that the beast appeared to be getting larger because it was flying straight toward him. John got into a firing stance and took aim as the beast approached. The beast drew near. John could hear its cries get louder and more ferocious and almost angry. When it was close, John fired a shot. The beast dodged and was untouched. John fired again, but the beast again dodged the bullet. The beast was almost upon him. John took a deep breath and fired again. The beast attempted to dodge again, but this time was unsuccessful. The bullet struck the beast in the wing and began to lose control of its flight. However, it was still hurling directly at John. John fired another shot as the beast slammed into him. The two tumbled down the road a distance. When John regained his wits, he realized he was lying on his back on the road, and the beast was on top of him. He didn't know where his gun was. The blow had knocked it from his hand. The beast struggled to its feet, and John could see that its wing was badly damaged. It stood over John in a grotesquely human fashion and stepped on John's chest to hold him down. The beast then thrust its head down toward John, and he was able to dodge to one side as he heard the beast's beak clamp shut next to his ear. It was trying to peck his face off. The beast attempted to strike over and over as John squirmed and dodged. John thought of Clinton again. He looked up at the hawk beast, and it reminded him of when the coyote beast had stood in front of him and removed its head to reveal Clinton again. Just before the hawk beast had scooped him up, John timed it, and as the beast attempted to peck again, it reached up and grabbed the sides of its head and pulled with all the strength that he had left. The beast squawked and cried as John pulled at its head. Soon the cries turned to the screams of a man as John tore the head off of the beast. Ferris stumbled backward. One of his arms was limp. It was the wing that had been struck by the bullet. John could see now that the shot he had fired just before the beast collided with him had also hit its target, as Ferris had an additional wound on the side of his torso. John got to his feet, and the two stared at each other. Ferris said that it had to end. He said the rules of the hunt could not be broken, and one of them was not leaving alive. He charged at John and braced himself. The two struggled, but in their weakened state, it was hardly a fight. Ferris headbutted John, and John countered by striking Ferris in the wounded side. The two stumbled to the ground and continued to strike at each other. Ferris managed to once again get John on his back and punched John with his good arm. After a few strikes, John saw an opportunity and dug his thumb deep into the wound in Ferris's side. Ferris screamed in pain and stood up. He stumbled back a few steps, and just as he looked John in the eye, a Jeep slammed into Ferris and skidded and swerved to a stop. John laid on the road. He looked to one side and could see his car a short distance away. He looked to the other side and could see a Jeep stopped in the road. A young man and a young woman were running toward him. He could hear them asking if he was okay. Another couple knelt over Ferris in his bird suit. He did not move. The young couple kneeled down next to John and asked again if he was okay. He told them he thought so, and then he passed out. A few weeks had passed, and John was still physically recovering. His arm was in a sling, and his body was covered with bumps and bruises and scratches. The kids in the Jeep had alerted authorities. John was taken to a hospital in the little mining town, and when he regained consciousness, the county sheriff's office had an officer at his bedside. The officer told John that Ferris was dead, and they had also found the bodies of Leo, Bobby, and Clinton at various points along the highway. When the officer asked John what had happened, he told them that he was just a rideshare driver who was unfortunate to pick up a group of psychotic furries. He said they turned on each other and on him, and that he had only been trying to defend himself and escape. The officer told John that the bodies all had evidence of wild animal attacks, to which John said coyotes or vultures must have gotten to the bodies before the sheriff's office did. When the officer asked John about his own animal attack-like wounds, he explained that there was a lot of biting and clawing and tumbling going on. The officer had reluctantly agreed, and the case, though still open, was for the most part put to rest. John had recently gotten his car back from the body shop that had repaired the damage to the hood, and he was finally able to get back to work. He had just logged into his rideshare apps for the first time since the day he had picked up Clinton. Ironically, he was parked in the same gas station. John received a notification from one of his apps and accepted the fare. The pickup address was a nearby apartment complex. A short time later, John arrived at the pickup address. A young couple was standing in the parking lot as he pulled up. He parked and rolled down the passenger window. He asked the girl if her name was Lena, and she confirmed that it was, so he unlocked the doors so they could get in to the back seat. Once seated, John confirmed where they were going. It was a concert venue downtown, and they began the trip. Along the way, John found himself unable to attempt small talk like he usually tried with customers. He was still psychologically rattled by what had happened the last time he had a passenger in his car. It was his passengers that broke the awkward silence by asking how his day was going. John apologized for not being very talkative. He explained that it was his first night back to work in a few weeks, and they were his first fare. The young man inquired as to why he hadn't worked for a few weeks. John told him that it was complicated and unbelievably crazy, but that he had been through something of an ordeal with the last fare he had transported. Lena asked him to elaborate, and John was reluctant. He told her that it would make him sound insane, and that he didn't even tell the authorities the whole truth for fear they would lock him up in a hospital somewhere. The young man sat forward and told John that they were used to people telling them things that they hadn't told authorities in strange cases. Then he explained to John that he and Lena had been through several unbelievable events. He asked John if he recognized him and apologized, saying that it might have sounded egotistical because it was not intended. They came to a red stoplight, and when he stopped, John took the opportunity to get a close look at the young man. He was right. John did recognize him. John asked the young man if he was the butcher who had stopped the mass shooting at the grocery store a few months prior. The young man replied, "Meat cutter, but yes, that's me. My name is Miguel Delgado." A man wearing an all-black suit and leather driving gloves approached the office of the president of the Greenhaven Country Club and knocked on the door. A man's voice from the other side of the door granted him permission to enter, and he did so. He closed the door behind him and approached the desk. The newly elected president of the country club sat at the desk, sipping a glass of scotch. He asked the man in the black suit if he had any news for him. The man in the black suit told him that the coroner had confirmed that the 4 dead they had been told about were the high desert hunting party. All 3 initiates and their mentor had been killed. He further explained that it appeared some of them had killed each other, while the ferruginous hawk had seemingly been killed by an outside witness whose information they also had. The president stood up and finished his glass of scotch in one gulp. He walked over to a cabinet and opened the 2 doors. He stared at the item hanging in the cabinet ominously. He asked the man in the black suit if the witness had revealed anything to anyone, presuming that they knew the truth after surviving. The man in the black suit explained that nothing had been revealed on any public platform or on the internet as of yet. The president reached into the cabinet and retrieved a large plush wolf mask. He stared at it for a moment, then put it back into the cabinet. He turned to the man in the black suit and said, "Track the witness." John is a good person and was just trying to make sure a stranger was going to be okay. Instead, he uncovered an underground lifestyle unlike anything of the natural world. How many members are in this mysterious hunting club? Thank you for listening. Support this podcast by clicking the link in the episode description. Support helps to improve production quality and production time. Questions or comments are always welcome. Use the link in the episode description to send me a voicemail, or look for me at my official website, iamlosetheartist.com, or on social media at iamlosetheartist. Until next time, I'm sorry if I scared you.